Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Mark Otieno. I'm a senior lecturer of agroecology in the University of Embu, and I'm also the Director of Research and Extension in this university, where I oversee all research that are being undertaken by staff, students, and all the visiting researchers here. The grant that I've won from the German Research Foundation, or the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, is actually to implement a project that is looking at the role of night-flying pollinators in the reproduction of coffee and papaya crops. And perhaps I need to explain what pollination is so that we put it into context. Pollination really is the transfer of pollen grains, which are the male gametes, from the male part of a flower to the female part of a flower. And the reason that happens is to effect fertilization, which results into seeds and the fruits. And some of these fruits are the ones we eat as human food. So this is an extremely relevant field, and is an extremely important phase for plants to go through so that we are able to get the next generation of plants. So for the people who are involved in this particular project, it will be implemented by a panel of researchers led by me here at the University of Embu. But I also have colleagues in Germany. There is a professor, Dr. Ingo Stefan de Winter, who is a professor of spatial ecology, plant-insect interactions, agroecosystem management, and crop pollination. We also have Dr. Marcel Peters, who is a specialist in montane biodiversity, ecology, and just looking at ecosystem services generally. So this is the team that is going to implement this 3-year project, which is supposed to start on in May of this 2023 up to May of 2026. Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Mark Otieno. I'm a senior lecturer of agroecology in the University of Embu, and I'm also the Director of Research and Extension in this university, where I oversee all research that are being undertaken by staff, students, and all the visiting researchers here. The grant that I've won from the German Research Foundation, or the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, is actually to implement a project that is looking at the role of night-flying pollinators in the reproduction of coffee and papaya crops. And perhaps I need to explain what pollination is so that we put it into context. Pollination really is the transfer of pollen grains, which are the male gametes, from the male part of a flower to the female part of a flower. And the reason that happens is to effect fertilization, which results into seeds and the fruits. And some of these fruits are the ones we eat as human food. So this is an extremely relevant field, and is an extremely important phase for plants to go through so that we are able to get the next generation of plants. So for the people who are involved in this particular project, it will be implemented by a panel of researchers led by me here at the University of Embu. But I also have colleagues in Germany. There is a professor, Dr. Ingo Stefan de Winter, who is a professor of spatial ecology, plant-insect interactions, agroecosystem management, and crop pollination. We also have Dr. Marcel Peters, who is a specialist in montane biodiversity, ecology, and just looking at ecosystem services generally. So this is the team that is going to implement this 3-year project, which is supposed to start on in May of this 2023 up to May of 2026. In research, again, you just don't do it for the sake of doing. There has to be an underlying reason or a gap to fill, and there are many of them, because there has been a worldwide trend in decline of pollinators generally because of many reasons. One of them is mainly because of human activities that is negatively affecting these pollinators. And as such, the day-flying pollinators, including bees, for example, have received a lot of attention. But while they're receiving a lot of attention, we do not know really the fate of other arthropods or insects that fly by night, for example, moths. In the tropical systems like ours, where we are in Kenya, we have a bigger diversity or larger diversity of these night-flying moths, and we know that the moths are actually adapted for visiting flowers, meaning they perform an important role in pollinating these flowers. yet there's really little information with regards to the contribution these moths play in crop production. So that is one of the things that informed my study area. The other thing is that there is a lot of emphasis on large-bodied visitors of flowers, which are pollinators. But one thing you need to understand is that these large-bodied insects are also very selective. They will always go for flowers that have bigger heads, also the ones that have better scent, smelling nicer. And they will not really pay attention to other crops that do not fit this kind of traits or characteristics. Hence, moths are one subset of insects that could actually really become handy with regards to visiting these flowers that are not visited by the more charismatic pollinators, you know, the honeybees, the carpenter bees, the bumblebees, the other types of bees that are normally popular with entomologists or people who are doing crop pollination. So I think it's important that we pay attention to also these night-flying pollinators, which are basically moths in our case here, and then understand what role really they play with regards to affecting crop production. Also, moths play two important roles. Number one is that these moths actually, for some subset of plants, they 100% rely on moths to effect pollination. But we really do not understand the set of flowers or the set of plants, species, that are pollinated chiefly by these moths. Number two is that because some areas might have deficits of bee densities, and bees are known for effective pollination, so what happens in areas that the population of bees is low? In those kind of areas, then moths can become handy in trying to fill the gaps that is occasioned by the shortfall in the bee densities. So that is how this study was informed, and we just hope that we are going to find the key role that these moths play in our two crops of choice. So one of the main activities of humans that impacts on these beneficial insects, which are pollinators, is, of course, as you correctly said, use of agrochemicals, and in this case, synthetic agrochemicals. They have a huge impact. And there's one class of agrochemicals, particularly pesticides, called neonicotinoids, which is a systemic pesticide, and it has a huge impact in terms of affecting not only the current population of adult foraging insects, but also their brood. So this has had to be banned in many countries, including the United States, including Europe. Unfortunately, this kind of pesticides are still in our market in Kenya here. So that's one of the problems. And then, of course, using synthetic fertilizers also has an impact on pollinators. With regards to other human activities, which is basically in terms of tillage, even on how they manage their fields intensively, how you plow your field will matter. So, for example, we have bee species, like some of them which you can probably see here later. They actually nest within the field, the crop field. They are not like honeybees that will go back to the hive. This one nest within the crop fields. So if you are plowing this field in a more intensive way, really you are destroying the habitat or the nests for these particular bees. And by the way, some of these bees, which are called the wild solitary bees, are extremely effective in pollinating our crops, even better than honeybees, because they visit more flowers per unit time compared to honeybees. They also check and carry more pollen nodes than the honeybees. So really, these are the ones that we need to pay more attention to when we are dealing with this aspect of pollination. So in that regard, therefore, we have three types of intensification based on use of agrochemicals. So the one that I talked about was use of synthetic agrochemicals, pesticides and fertilizers. There's also a medium intensification, which is the use of biochemicals. These are biopesticides and biofertilizers. They do not have a footprint like the synthetic fertilizers and synthetic pesticides. Those are a bit mild. It's called more benign to the environment. And of course, you can use them at the same time that bees are also active. There's also another management of these fields where farmers do not actually apply anything at all, or they apply traditional methods to control these pesticides, for example. So there are those three. There's one which is low intensive kind of farming where farmers do not apply these agrochemicals. There's medium where they use biopesticides and biofertilizers. And then there's the more intense where they use synthetic fertilizers. So those are them. And then also, with regards to the proportion of land that is tilled, vis-a-vis the total acreage under a farmer is also an indicator of intensification. So for example, if you have a farm that 70% of it is under crop and 30% is under what we call semi-natural, natural vegetation, which could be bushes, which could be shrubs and some small forest, that will be a more intense field than a farm that 30% of it is under crop and 70% of it is under these kind of habitats that I've talked about. With regards to promotion of development, which we are calling sustainable development here, this research really links very well to SDG number 2, which is zero hunger. Why? Because pollinators are extremely important in increasing not only the quality, but also the quantity or yield of the crops. So I'm looking at coffee here, and I'm also looking at pawpaw or papaya. These are two economically important crops that fetch quite a bit of money for farmers. So what is important is that if we have these pollinators in the system and they are able to increase the yield and also the quality of this yield, then the farmers will be able to get more money coming in. And of course, in terms of zero hunger, of course, there will be enough food for people to eat. Now, just going back to something like coffee, for example, there has been research that has shown repeatedly that there is increase in cap quality on the coffee plants that were visited by some of these bees and other pollinators as well. So this is a direct link, it's a direct impact on the yield that the pollinators will have. So in terms of improving yield, which means less hunger, because you have money, you can afford to buy food, then this is very relevant in that sense. And just, of course, in terms of sustainable environment or improving the environmental quality is also something that is aligned to our Vision 2030, for example, here in Kenya, and of course also goes back to the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. So in terms of food security, I've already touched on it a bit when I was discussing about the sustainable development, and that is because in a system where we have a high density and a high diversity of pollinators, it means that therefore we have more of the pollination service, which is called an ecosystem service rendered by nature for human well-being. That means that we will have more crops setting, and of course diversity is always good. So if we have safety in this number, we are able to increase our food. And this is something that even FAO has recognized, the role of having the diversity of these pollinators in the system with regards to improving of our yield and the quality of that yield. So in terms of nutritional security, we are safe. In terms of just food security, we are safe at the same time. Now, with regards to biodiversity, also pollinators are very important in that sense because they form the link between the farmland, the agroecosystems, and the natural field or the natural system. The same pollinators or the same insects that visit the crop flowers are the same ones that visit the wild plants. And why wild plants? Because wild plants are actually, the diversity in wild plants is important because they're actually forming the whole system to operate as it is. The fresh oxygen that we breathe comes from plants, right? And for the plants to reproduce, they will produce flowers that must be visited by some of these pollinators to set fruit, which will be seeds later to propagate into the next generation. So in terms of even things like soil erosion, stabilization of soil, for example, if we have these plants in a system, then that's very good. So that's all the benefits of biodiversity in a particular area. Look at the animals, wild animals. So for example, something like birds. Birds eat fruits and seed, right? And without those pollinators to turn the flowers into fruit and seed, we'll lose our birds in the system, the squirrels and all the rodents, and everything else. You know, the elephants will eat some of these, the branches and the vegetation in the place. So all these actually are all tied together in a system that is so complex that if you remove the pollinators from that system, then we are going to impact so negatively in the balance in the ecosystem that we have. So those are the three key things that this research is actually going to plug in. So there are a number of things, but I will just address a few gaps that are existing, especially with even research on coffee and papaya with regards to moths. So there's one study that looked at moths, and these were specifically the hawk moths, which are day-flying moths, and sometimes twilight. Twilight meaning they're called crepuscular, which means they fly around sunset time. So one of the issues that is that the study measured the linear distance between this semi-natural vegetation I talked about, the shrubs, bushes, and whatever, to these papaya fields, for example. and then equated the number of visits to the effectiveness of the pollination of the papaya crop. But that is good that way, but that does not take into account what goes on in the whole landscape. Remember this, and again, they are moths. So they are not actually looking at the diversity of moths totally. These are hawk moths they are looking at, okay? Which I think there were 3 species that the existing literature looked at. So ours is going to be looking at a whole landscape approach, because we know that these moths are active in a wider area. If it's for diurnal, which we are calling the day-flying pollinators, most of them will fly to about 1 kilometer from the center of a field. But if you look at moths, for example, they can fly anywhere between 3 kilometers and 5 kilometers of field. So they are actually going huge, in a huge area looking for food. So what we are going to do is we are going to take into account this landscape scale or context. So in a field, we are going to be looking at what is the landscape surrounding this field up to 3 kilometers radius of the field. Understand the different types of land use and land cover types and how the moths are interacting with these land cover types. So that is new. And then the other thing that is new in this work is that we are going a step further, not necessarily looking at the plants that support the larvae of the moths, because the previous studies looked at a few plants that were supporting hawk moths. So you know, moths and butterflies, they will lay eggs, preferably on a house plant. The eggs will hatch into a larvae. The larvae will feed on this plant. They will pipette, and then they will emerge as adults and now start visiting flowers. So in our case, we would like to understand the range of plants that these moths actually utilize. And we are going to use an extremely modern technology, which is called the pollen metabarcoding, which is basically a DNA of trying to tease apart the mix of different DNAs of plants or pollen. Then you will be able to tell that this particular moth or this particular insect visited X number of flowers of different species based on the footprint they have on this technique we are referring to as metabarcoding. So that is new. That is something that has not been done yet for this particular study. And many others, because we also want to investigate effect of light pollution on the performance of these night flying pollinators. Because now we have a lot of light sources. Most villages are actually getting electricity. But how does that electricity impact on the functionality of these moths with regards to them finding the flowers? Because the moths have evolved to see darkness, so they really go by scent. But if now you put lights around, maybe it disorients them. But to what extent? That is something that the study is also going to find out. So, and many others, but those are the key things that inform this study. So there are a number of stakeholders, key stakeholders who will benefit from this research. And of course, where I sit, the farmer is the first one to benefit from this research. And how? The farmer will be able to tell that these insects that the farmer has been seeing on their field, whether it's coffee or papaya, actually is worth this amount, because we are going to do economic evaluation. So we are going to tell the farmer that this species of moth or bee is actually contributing X amount of Kenya shillings with regards to coffee. So for example, if you produce coffee 1 kilo, we have equations that we can be able to, and we have a series of experiments that will be able to tell us that. So we can be able to tell the farmer, hey, if you have 10 bees in your system, you get 2 kilograms of coffee, or you get 3 to 4 pawpaw fruits. And a pawpaw fruit is X amount in the market. So this is how much this bee is actually contributing towards your pocket. Now, with that language, a farmer is able to save or to protect this particular insect or the habitat that this insect lives in. You cannot protect what you don't know. You protect what you know, and especially if it's bringing money to your pocket. Then you are motivated to do something to protect it. That's number one. Number two is for conservationists. So again, we are going to, with this pollen metabarcoding technique, we are going to tell that a moth that visits coffee also visits maybe 100, maybe 200 other plants in the system, meaning that all these are connected together in a network. So for conservationists, this is very important, because when coffee is not flowering, remember these insects are still in the system. So they need to be feeding somewhere. So we understand what other food resources are there to support these insects while the main crop is not in season in terms of flowering. So that is important in terms of even understanding what are the threats for this. They are called co-flowering plants. What are the threats for these co-flowering plants? in terms of even their herbivory, in terms of the pests and their diseases. And with this information, it's important for these conservationists now to be able to champion or to mobilize local actors to direct protection towards these particular co-flowering plants, because they are very important in terms of the reserve. They form reserve food while the main crop like coffee or papaya is not flowering. That is important. And again now, from those kind of efforts, it can be at a national level where now there is more formal protection offered by the government, for example. So conservation will really benefit from this work. The other group are ecologists. Ecologists, because of understanding the diversity and density of moths in different places, and also the economic value that each of these species have in terms of fruit set and yield of coffee and papaya. That's very important for them, because then they can be able to come out and investigate more in terms of the ecological needs of these pollinators. Apart from just utilizing coffee and papaya flowers, what are their other needs? Even where do they nest? I just talked about some of the insects that really nest within the field, but where within the field? So we need to understand that. Their nest structure, what are the threats that they are facing in that kind of area, and this will inform protection as well. So that is important for ecologists. And most importantly, for policymakers, which is something that has been missing a lot, is to be able to come up with a formal pollinator protection plan or a management plan for this kind of pollinators that we know have a high economic value. This is a conversation that we might have even at a different level. In Kenya, we are yet to get there. At the moment, I know there is a conference going on in Uganda that is linking science to policy. How do you break down science and link it to policy? We are missing that. So that's very important. So like, for example, we do not have a formal policy on pollination protection or pollinator protection, leave alone ecosystem service protection. Even though we had a policy review recently, the agriculture policy in Kenya, with the former CS for agriculture. Yeah. Research in Kenya generally requires more support from government. And if we had something like a one-stop shop for research clearance, that would be very, very useful. At the moment, and I'm saying this for the nation to know, that it's extremely fragmented. It's in different places. So for example, if you want to do research, the kind of research that I do, first of all, you'll go to Nakosti to get a license to do the research. Now, if it's in a national park, you'll go to Wirti to get access. Then KWS needs to get access again to get to the national parks, to access the wildlife resources there. If you want to export for identification elsewhere, you need to go to NEMA to clear you. If it's a forest first, before you get to the park, you need to go through KFS. If it's some material that have phytosanitary issues, then you go through KEFIS. Now this is a long process, and each of the steps takes very long. I can tell you that because I have experience, which is for my ongoing projects, not this one, but others. So moving forward, it will be very important for government, because if you put it in one house, like now we have one border post that processes everything if you want to export something out of the country. Why don't we make research to be more easy for researchers in Kenya? Because Kenya has very good researchers. But because of all these obstacles on the way, I call them obstacles because at one level you can take 6 months. Then you move to the next level. Now imagine you have a grant of 3 years, or let's say 2 years. But you've spent the first year just looking for clearances to do research. I mean, you've already wasted 1 year. So where do you recoup or recover that time? That is one of the frustrations. But anyway, the other things about enhancing research in this country would be more of capacity building of our researchers, so that they can come up to par, up to international standards and level. We can do things like improving skills in writing, for example, because most of our colleagues might not really have the skill of writing. Winning grants, because that's a skill you need to have, and you need to be taken through the process of how to do it and practice it all the time. So capacity building is very important. We also can talk about investing a little bit more in infrastructure, like laboratories, for example. Like this one that we have is a very well-stocked laboratory. So we have in this university, for example, one that is dealing with molecular biology. We have a laboratory in biotechnology. We have one on botany. We have zoology. We have physics. We have chemistry lab. We have now an entomology lab that we are running our entomological work in. And this is important because not only for training our undergraduate research students and doing practicals, but our postgraduate students, but most importantly, our colleagues who are academic members of staff, who, like the Vice Chancellor says, we are mandated to do research, teaching, and extension. But mostly maybe we are doing teaching, and we are not doing enough research. So we really need to focus on research as well, and these facilities infrastructure can help us. The other infrastructure is, of course, something like a research library, which is important, and then also having IT support for this kind of work that we do. Those are very, very important to have. And then also, in Kenya, we have an issue with policy benefiting from research findings, which we need to have. I mean, how do you make policy decision and it's not backed by research findings? Yeah, I find that a bit limiting in this country. So what we need to do really is to find a way that we connect research with policy. And again, try and lobby for the powers that be, or even the powers that be really, the people at the ministry. We need to create an environment where policymakers reach out to research, or if there's an issue that they need to really make a decision on, they need to actually come to researchers. Maybe even bespoke. Bespoke means that it's tailor-made for that particular need, so that they can actually be making a decision based on some scientific principles or scientific findings.